some colleagues from Estonia and also from Lithuania, not only from Riga, some interesting feedbacks or how they are dealing with the issues in the large-scale settlements. Now, once we have done all of this, I think the most important is also to discuss the general questions of policy and of strategies. So how do we, here in Riga, specifically in Riga, try to combat a situation that starts to really get serious? We have to find measures, we have to find strategies, we have to find policies, and we don't have to only find them, we also seriously have to start to get an action. And therefore the City Architect Office invited a very, how to say, well-informed person, not only because of her international, I would say, very competitive standing, what she is doing in all the last decades in planning and especially in the question of housing, but even more to invite somebody who had been already working here approximately 10 to 15 years ago, and in the year 2000 even publishing really a book which is asking for a reform and which is asking very much to develop a policy and develop a strategy on how to deal with the questions of housing in Riga. It's my big pleasure to welcome Sasha Tsenkova, who is internationally well known, but actually she's located at Calgary, professor for planning and international development. Sasha, I would like to give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here in Riga, and it's a privilege to be part of the discussions today. I try to be a silent observer and really try to understand the pace of change and the transformation process that has taken Riga in a very interesting direction in the last decade. I'm very grateful to be invited to contribute to your emerging discourse on housing policy and priorities in terms of retrofitting parts of the city, and particularly some of its challenging neighborhoods in the post-socialist era. And I really would like to stay away from the term that has been used so far, micro-rayon, because I think that we should start thinking about these places that are an imprint of a socialist legacy as something which is quite resilient today. And it's a place to live, a place to raise a family, and a place to work and enjoy the city. So these, by all means, should become viable and vibrant neighborhoods of the future. So Riga's transformation is really a very important one, particularly in this country, where about a third of Latvia's population is concentrated in Riga, certainly more than half of the urban population. Riga punches above its size in terms of its significance for the economy of the country. It accounts for more than half of the GDP. It's certainly an economic driver, but it's also a place of urban creativity. Research is something that we saw today, and also innovation. And certainly Riga has a spatial structure and elements of its urban landscape that go back 800 years, and are really a testament to what creativity, excellence in architecture, but also organic development can achieve. And the old Riga is not surprisingly the UNESCO heritage site. So are some parts of Riga, the districts of Art Nouveau, that really are probably much more beautiful and more impressive than the other parts of Art Nouveau in Vienna that effectively compete with what was created in the past. Riga's transformation by all measures has been very, very dramatic. Again, I was working in the city in the early 2000s for about a couple of years. These were small-scale capacity building, technical assistance projects financed by the Canadian International Development Agency. So there were a number of issues that we were asked to address. The first publication is really titled Riga, Housing Policy and Practice, was the first attempt to do a housing market as well as housing policy assessment for the city as a framework for reform. These were really exciting times. The city of Riga, the municipality, was privatizing about 180,000 apartments just within 2 years. Just a conservative estimate at the time that we did meant that just within 1 year, they have devolved an equivalent of 25% of Latvia's GDP into private hands without the necessary regulatory institutional framework to manage that. So we were also asked to assist the municipality, but also the then housing privatization and later on housing agency with the establishment of programs to train managers of privatized housing, to establish some of the ground rules and to rewrite some of the rules for more effective management of multifamily housing. And you see some of the outcomes of these projects. Of course, people were welcome to Calgary and Canada to learn how some of these processes are dealt with in our context. And some of these management manuals, and I still remember the word in Latvian grammata because it was so important to come up with that manual. They were really richly illustrated by very talented Latvian artists, which actually some of these cartoons captured the essence of the moment. The first one, really, people were petrified by the fact that cars were taking over, something that they used to appreciate as the courtyard, the common spaces that a lot of people today, in a very creative and innovative way, from Riga, from Tallinn and Lithuania and Vilnius, were trying to redesign. So the cars were taking over. And it was really an interesting story because by the time privatization started, actually the car ownership in Riga had tripled and quadrupled. So obviously cars were taking over the green spaces, and it was a kind of a spatial management based on fear. So if you're more affluent, more arrogant, then you park your car just in front of the entrance. And then you fight for that space, and then it becomes your space. There were also some other interesting illustrations of the issues that went along with the privatization and rewriting of the rules and the devolution of public and social assets into private hands. There was this messy business of accounting, trying to figure out who pays for what and how much does it cost. And then there were private management companies that collected contributions from then new homeowners and disappeared. And of course, there were many other stories to tell that actually illustrated this amazing transformation in the housing marketplace of Riga at the time. The objectives of my presentation are actually threefold. First of all, I'd like to highlight some of the major challenges in Riga's housing market and what it means for housing policy, to inform the discourse that is obviously kick-started through this conference and some of the research commissioned by the Chief Architect's Office, but also done throughout a number of universities in Latvia and also independent think tanks and NGOs. The second related objective is to review the impact of housing policy on Riga's suburban neighborhoods. And and again I'm using the word neighborhood deliberately because I think that these places that we talked about should become places of hope. They should discover their own identity, and we should not be labeling them as the microrioms in the future. And the third objective is to identify a few development strategies for change that are based on best practices of neighborhood regeneration in European cities. And I've worked in perhaps way too many, but I've selected Amsterdam, Vienna, and Stockholm, and some highlights of urban regeneration projects that I thought would be the most appropriate as a development and institutional model for Riga's development in the future. Coming back to the issue of housing, and I think some of the speakers early this morning highlighted the importance of housing markets, but also of housing policy. And it's really very, very important to realize that in many respects, housing is an integral part of our neighborhoods and our cities. In most of the cases, in planning and design terms, it's really something that absorbs about half of the built-up space. It is also people's home, and very often in nations of homeowners, the largest asset that people will ever have, will ever purchase or commit to. But also from a city's point of view, housing is a very, very important and essential ingredient of the economic pulse of any city. So vibrant housing markets also indicate a vibrant labor market, growth in terms of economic wealth, also jobs and attractiveness of the city for the local, the national, and the global economy. We learned a very, very tough lesson and an important lesson indeed in the last few years, and Riga and Latvia has been part of that very, very tough learning when we actually thought that houses will save the world. And this is an image from The Economist from 2004, when indeed escalating house prices around the globe and in large metropolitan areas was thought to be the savior and something that was going to get us out of the recession. So there were a lot of hopes. There was a lot of creative innovation of financial institutions, uniquely repackaging mortgage debt and selling it to others, until we actually came to something completely different in 2007, and that was triggered by the crisis in the housing markets in the United States and the collapsing financial system, which because of globalization and interconnectedness actually affected every single economy around the world, and anything from housing markets to labor markets, places in Iceland, places in Southeast Asia, notably China, but also Europe and places such as Riga and Latvia were in major recession. Part of that is attributed, of course, to the legacy of past policies and to the fact that there is a very, very high exposure to risk when you have nations of homeowners. And a lot of the post-socialist societies actually are today nations of homeowners. And this is the level of homeownership in a cluster of Eastern and Central European countries, with Albania at the top and Montenegro having 98 and 100% of homeownership. A lot of that actually created literally overnight through housing privatization. And at the tail end, here is Latvia, 77%, which I think today is close to 85%. And Poland and the Czech Republic that still retain a sizable share of their cooperative housing and municipal or publicly owned social housing. So that extreme risk, that exposure to home ownership and asset building through the housing sector, driven to a large extent by privatization policies, actually exposed societies, post-socialist societies and cities to a great deal of risk that people and policymakers were not really aware of before. And of course, there is something else which is associated with privatization and the dramatic shift from centrally planned to market-based economies and societies, and that is housing and income inequalities. And so, indeed, today a lot of the presentations showed many of these housing estates, these landmarks of socialist housing policy, but that was an egalitarian policy that responded to growing housing need, rapid urbanization in post-socialist cities, in a way that was inspired by the utopia of modernist planning. So standardized housing, system-built places, boxing people into the same types of apartments, regardless of their social status or consumer preference. The housing privatization, however, legitimized these inequalities, because there is obviously today something that is quite apparent. It was not clear in those days when privatization and voucher privatization in Latvia was taking place, is the inequality in terms of house prices and housing and social status that actually comes along with where you live and the type of housing that you actually own. What happened in Latvia was something that was also unique in many ways. First of all, Latvia delayed its privatization by almost a decade. And I kind of call that decade, the early 90s, the lost decade. Because the country, the politicians, and everyone else was really too busy with economic transformation, structural reforms, unemployment, runaway inflation. They were too busy to think about housing issues. I guess they were too busy to think about serious housing policy also a decade later, from what I understood today. So the impact on new housing was a completely market-driven response. So the state had disappeared. That was a major investor that was investing in the housing estates, that was propping up state enterprises. So it was really a very convenient model that worked quite well in a number of post-socialist cities. People today talked about the fact that half of Riga's population actually lives in panel housing. I have to tell you that that was also the case in Prague, in Bucharest, in Sofia, of course in Moscow, a lot of places that embraced panel technology and system-built housing, very different from the story in the Balkans, such as Belgrade and Zagreb, where they simply refused to buy into it. So what happened with the disappearance of the state enterprise and the state as investor in housing, of course there was a massive decline and a loss of residential capital. So one of the best things that was happening to Riga in the early 2000s that we noticed from a housing policy point of view is actually people were getting more housing space per person, not because more homes were built and then there was a response on behalf of the market-driven system, but because actually the city was shrinking. So the city's population at the time was close to 760,000. So the market took a while to actually bounce back and come out of the recession, and this is how the story of resilience is so important. So there was a robust industry that appeared to some extent propped up by industrial privatization, by interest from foreign investment, mostly from Scandinavian but also German companies. So the market started to respond. In the year 2000, the city again had a population of 760,000 and over 60,000 households on the municipal waiting list for housing, was actually producing 49 apartments per week. It was just a crisis that I haven't really seen in any other post-socialist city. It was really critical. Now, this is plotting some of these construction rates in new housing per 1,000 residents in some of the Central European as well as Baltic states. And black is actually Latvia. You can see that after 2000, that was really a critical tipping point. Things started to improve. And actually the housing industry emerged out of a very, very deep recession. Of course, a lot of the new housing that was built was suburban. It was single-family homes, very often behind the gates, exclusive housing communities. Again, the industry responded, the market responded, but it was no longer affordable housing. It was a housing type of product that was marketed to upper middle class and indeed very affluent people in the city. The other part of the story that is really also a testament to resilience was the ability of the banking sector to emerge very quickly out of the crisis again from something which was non-existent in terms of mortgage lending in 2000. There was a very, very rapid growth. And mortgage lending was kind of cash in 2002, so it was really done with privileged clients. Look at the comparison again in 2008. So Latvia, as well as neighboring Estonia, actually having penetration of mortgage lending, which begins to be very close to the European Union average. So very, very dramatic growth. Part of that is due to the privatization of banks, standardization of mortgage lending, the fact that the Swedish banks were really very comfortable operating here. Now, after the crisis, particularly in housing markets, that kick-started a whole collapse of different financial and mortgage systems across the world. Latvia was really one of the countries that was hit very badly. So the rate of mortgage default in Latvia, I'm told, is actually as high as 20%. That is probably a record high number that is very close to what they had in the worst days in the U.S. Now, coming back to the housing policy challenges. So the first decade was kind of lost decade because people and the politicians were really focusing on the economy, some social transformation policies, but certainly housing was not on the top of the political agenda. So it was completely lost. Another decade came along, and perhaps the landmark of that transformation was the privatization of state and municipal housing. And it's true that in Riga, the municipal housing really was very, very significant, so it took a while to actually absorb that process, to set up even institutions that could handle the simple transfer of that asset to city tenants. It was very clear at the time that if housing privatization was taking place without clear institutions to assume the responsibilities of home ownership, in those not condominium, but high-rise buildings, it was setting a lot of people and communities to fail in the future. So the lack of clear regulatory framework was really a major challenge, and I understand that it's still a challenge today. A lot of what the Estonian colleagues called housing communities or housing associations here still do not exist. So people haven't really taken over ownership of common areas, so that home ownership literally is encapsulated between the wallpaper. And that really begins to explain why there is really little interest and little investment and a sense of ownership and belonging when it comes to the common area, the outside spaces, as well as beyond. So the legislation was incomplete, and it might be incomplete still today. Also, another very important element of the reform that created and still continuing to create a lot of challenges at the local level, the municipal level, is the fact that housing responsibilities were delegated to municipal governments. And the responsibility for housing assistance, for social housing, was also developed to the municipal level. So the disappearance of the central government or state institutions from housing policy was not really a very healthy aspect of the reform process, because local governments had limited capacity to raise revenues. They also had to deal with issues such as running the public transit, dealing with roads, sewer systems, waste management. So really this is crowding out the opportunity to take a strategic view and to intervene seriously in the housing arena. And again, this is something that remains unique in the case of Latvia's housing policy agenda. And the last element, which again contributes to a lot of the challenges in those suburban neighborhoods that have relatively high density or perhaps well-serviced with public transit and have very generous allocation of green spaces, is the ineffective rule enforcement and limited capacity to implement housing policy. It's also related to something that definitely is very, very unique in the case of post-socialist transformation, the restitution of land in those areas where, in many cases, as some of the research in the morning indicated, there is really a very complicated property ownership map that indicates different types of ownership over the land, over the buildings, over the common areas, over the streets, etc. So that complexity is definitely very difficult to manage. So Riga's neighborhoods, and indeed that's one of the more recent housing estates built in the 80s, really high density development, standardized type of construction. What is lacking in that neighborhood, and is still lacking today based on some of the observations that I have in various neighborhoods, is the type of vitality that the old Riga and the old neighborhoods of Riga actually possess. The vibrancy of different types of activities, jobs, small-scale retail, also social infrastructure that actually make these places a home to many people, as opposed to keeping it as a bedroom community. Now, some of the places that we visited, and I'm very, very grateful to the chief architect as well as his staff for really taking the time to show some of these places so that I can relate better to the research that was presented today. These are some of the entrances, not particularly welcoming. In fact, to an outside observer, this might actually send a signal, this place is definitely unsafe, it's probably going to be abandoned very quickly. Not necessarily the case. It's actually something that a lot of the research this morning indicated means a lot to people. Over 70% of the people actually are satisfied with these conditions, and that is exactly the same neighborhood that a lot of the people researched in the last couple of years. So what has happened here is really a cycle of deprivation that in physical terms is becoming quite explicit. This graph at the bottom, if you look at the red line, it indicates the fact that high-rises, vertical living, is actually something that is extremely, extremely demanding over the life cycle of the building, particularly when the building reaches a critical point of 20 years. People that deal with life cycle assessment, a lot of construction engineers, the technical expertise in Latvia is certainly available. They will tell you right away what happens to the building structure, the technical, the engineering systems, the roof. if there is no adequate maintenance and life cycle replacement of those elements. So to bounce back, and what the red line indicates, you actually all of a sudden need 2 and 3 times more capital and more investment to bring these structures back. So what people really, the homeowners in these units, probably don't understand is the fact that they are actually owning a liability, and it's not an asset. On a very positive note, and I think that some of the design solutions, and particularly some of the sociological studies today, actually were quite insightful and informative about these patterns of social interaction that may or may not take place in these very generous courtyards and common areas. They're not necessarily common areas because they're privately owned in Riga, but they're used by the residents very often to just transition from their entrance to the building to maybe the transit stop. But there was also something very positive. So that was a group of seniors, and we were there probably around 11, so kind of midday. A group of seniors that were simply chatting, and I'm not sure if you can actually see the benches here, but there is concrete here attached to the benches. So they were uprooted from somewhere and actually brought to this place so that people have a place where they can actually socialize. And that is a very positive sign. The other very positive sign, and I know most of you probably dislike the urban graffiti, but today there were some presentations that did highlight the importance of urban creativity. And also, I think it was my Riga group that talked about, the power of urban transformation through pop-up parks and structures. A lot of cities do spend a lot of money to clean up graffiti. In most cases, they've given up. In this case, actually, as I was taking a picture of that wall, there were a few children that went by and then came back and explained that it's a Russian artist who lives here who actually has created that. So it was their wayfinding. It was a landmark that actually defeats that anonymity so that people can recognize their buildings. And it's someone that they know that actually created that artistic expression. And some of us might not like it, but maybe it's a sign that people in this place do need an identity, and they do need ways of identifying themselves with the place, with the structures, with the neighborhood again. On a very positive side, it was one of the courtyards that actually was reinvented as a multi-story building, and I was told that that was a kindergarten before, which kind of explains why this is a gated place. So there are newcomers to the neighborhood that actually coexist with the old residents from the privatized housing. And maybe, as one of the presenters today actually said, she's probably part of the 25% of people that are dissatisfied with the neighborhood and the quality of life there. Because there are also some renters that live in those places. There are also people that haven't privatized that are social tenants. So there is this diversity, there is a mix of different arrangements, and there are the new and the old residents that essentially have to share the same assets. There were also positive examples of energy efficiency retrofitting, these projects that are really very beneficial. It's not just because you save energy, and that has a lot of potential. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. So these were very, very positive examples, which brings me to, again, high rates of home ownership and really the need to leverage that private capital. Because people need to know that they are really at risk of owning a liability, as I said, a declining asset. Again, if you compare high rates of home ownership, but also the commitment to home ownership across different countries in the former socialist bloc that are part of the European Union with the EU average, the blue bar here will show you the very high share of homeowners that actually own housing that is mortgage-free. There is no liability associated with it. On the other side of the ocean, where we also have similarly high rates of home ownership, very often people are a paycheck away from actually being evicted from their own houses because the mortgage is a very, very significant commitment, and it absorbs anything from 30 to 50% of the household income. So in Latvia, that is actually quite exceptional, and as you can see, it's over 80% compared to the European Union average, where about 42, 43% of the homeowners across Europe will be in a similar situation. So it is very important to leverage that, to make sure that homeowners understand the bundle of responsibilities as well as the bundle of rights that comes along with being a homeowner. And that may mean innovative financial products, that may be reverse mortgages, where you borrow against the value of your asset, and it's a significant asset. House prices in Riga actually have increased 700 to 800%. That is before the crash. They have declined dramatically. They have declined by something like 60 to 80%, which is a global record, sadly. But still, these are very, very significant assets that are very often 10 to 20 times the annual income of the people that live in those houses. So, coming back to the policy arena, and it's not easy, and here it is particularly challenging because of the restitution process, because of the lack of clear ownership responsibility assigned to the homeowners associations, also because of a planning regime that is somewhat prescriptive, and really it does not allow sufficient creativity and intervention in these kinds of neighborhoods that have a unique set of circumstances and challenges. So there is a fair amount that can be accomplished through planning instruments and land deals and different kinds of public-private partnerships. But that really needs to be supported by a fairly robust system of fiscal and financial instruments. And these are some of the examples that I would like to discuss in my next part of the presentation. Housing and urban regeneration opportunities. And firstly, this is an example from Vienna. Again, Vienna is a city of about 1.2 million. It's interesting to note that 50% of the housing in Vienna is actually socially owned. It's a city of renters. And so it's a very inclusive city where they maintain a strategy of mixing people and housing opportunities throughout the city. It's something that Riga actually has and needs to retain. It's really an asset in terms of social inclusion in the city building. So in this example in Vienna, it's a regeneration of a central area, part of brownfield development, the Kavelberg site, where a factory became obsolete, so the whole site is developed with rental and ownership opportunities, about 950 dwellings. As anything in Vienna, it was the outcome of a design competition. But what is really interesting here is that they actually wanted to create this neighborhood as something which has all the ingredients of a vibrant place in the central city. So they provided shopping, retail opportunities, of course, social infrastructure like the kindergartens, small-scale incubators for people to work, so this doesn't become abandoned during the day and it's not a bedroom community. And of course it's serviced with the transit, the tram, and also other buses and different types of transportation. The other interesting element here is that it's mixed in terms of ownership. So it's not really planned and built exclusively for homeowners, but it has a 10-year mix of renters and owners, even within one building envelope. And this is something, again, that Riga has, by and large, as a result of the housing privatization. So, and certainly in some cases, because of the views, the homeowners live on in the penthouses, the top floor, and the renters are the ground level. But also the neighborhood has a number of different typologies. And when you think in terms of intensification and bringing more vitality and perhaps more people and activities to a lot of the suburban housing estates, it's really critical to think about diversity as well. Because it's really an important departure from the old model where everyone had to be boxed exactly in the same types of housing in the suburban realm. Another example from Amsterdam, and again it's a classical example of city building, the old city, which has evolved organically but also in a very planned way with a system of canals and neighborhoods that were started from the medieval wall. Now the red areas are actually a lot of the areas that were built after the Second World War. And when we talk about Soviet times and Soviet legacy, actually a lot of the European cities, Western European cities, will have exactly the same housing estates. This is prefabricated housing built using very similar technologies and very similar planning principles. High density living, lots of green space, separation of land uses, really utopia on trial. So what is happening in Amsterdam is because they have, again, it's a city of renters and the share of social housing is over 50%. A lot of these neighborhoods, the red areas here, gradually have become the home of a lot of ethnic groups, a lot of people that are not necessarily high-income people, and less desirable places to live. So a lot of these areas will have a very high share of social housing, in fact over 75%. So the strategy to bring them back is again social engineering, rebuilding of those neighborhoods as mixed income, mixed tenure communities, where just like in the Vienna example, just like in the old city of Amsterdam, there is this messy vitality, the integration of jobs, small-scale retail, as well as housing in one area. So moving away from the modernist reality of generous green spaces, which actually today someone compared their courtyard with one of the largest squares in the old Riga. So very similar sort of approach. If you look at the urban morphology of a lot of these places, that type of modernist thinking actually violated a lot of the ground rules for reasonable and pragmatic city planning and building. If you look at these buildings, there is nothing wrong with it. There is, of course, attention to the public realm, bringing in new technologies for waste management, energy efficiency retrofits, but also places of employment, again, to make sure that these communities begin to mix different people, different activities in the city. My last example is from Stockholm. And again, in Stockholm, there was the Million Home Program, and maybe some of you know a lot about it. When they, again, in the 60s, they responded to housing shortages, the typical social welfare response with a state responsibility. In this case, municipalities are building and managing social housing, very much like in a lot of the socialist cities. So a lot of these estates actually gradually became a less desirable place to live. So what they did is, again, something which is quite interesting, not just retrofitting the building and adding new features and a little bit of diversity to move away from a very uniform type of product and development, but also enhancing the playgrounds, the schools, of course, bringing colors in the scheme. The reason why lots of people actually come to this suburban place, and it's about 40 minutes by commuter train from the center of Stockholm, is because here the local authorities did something that was very different, and I thought it was very, very smart and inspiring at the same time. They actually went out and they engaged the people. And sometimes we plan and design and we just fall into the trap of environmental determinism and professional solutions to people that actually are not necessarily the smart solution and the best solution that they want. So here, what they found out is the local authorities were spending a fortune trying to remove graffiti, trying to install security cameras to see who is actually vandalizing the new playgrounds, trying to understand why people actually don't like the things that they have created in this neighborhood. And it's really very dangerous with an urban forest and all of that. But again, people were not really engaged. Just like in Riga, they were engaged in the planning and the design process, but they were not engaged in the implementation process. And the story was very identical to the story that we heard today from my Riga group, that went, consulted, and actually provided some very interesting design solutions to these green spaces, and yet they were either abandoned or demolished or vandalized or removed. Now, something similar was happening here, but when they actually started to engage the people in the actual building process, they recruited local people as managers, as part of the construction crew. Across the road, there is one of the largest universities in Stockholm. They set up special training and employment engagement programs to just create this sense of ownership and belonging. And so things started to change. And so there is obviously an effort in terms of placemaking. There is obviously the environmental, the green agenda that is being pursued in terms of effective waste management strategies. But there are also these sculptures created with input from local artists that no one is vandalizing and no one is trying to remove. So there is private ownership, and I think people today, there were suggestions about community gardens and urban agriculture. They also did a bit of that, and it doesn't mean that it's a uniform solution. It doesn't mean that we will become self-sufficient and we'll start growing cabbage and carrots, although there are books that advocate for that. There's the Carrot City book. But it also means that some of that green space is allocated for productive uses. So people that want to work in the community garden, that want to bring some of the products from that community garden to the local marketplace are really welcome to do so. And it ended up being very popular because some of the extended families had seniors living in the house that really didn't know what to do with their free time. They felt part of the group. And then things started to happen. So my message here is that obviously there is a need for multidisciplinary approaches to the planning, the redesign, and the strategic redevelopment of those suburban neighborhoods in the future. Too much is at stake. They're really a privately owned asset, but they're certainly an asset to the city, and they're really the whole, half of Riga's people. What I'm actually going to argue for, and it's something that goes back to the initiative championed by the Chief Architect's Office, which I think is a fine initiative, a great one, that really needs the support and the engagement of many different institutions and stakeholders. I'm going to argue for more flexible planning. A lot of the prescriptive and detailed planning is not going to be very helpful. It's not going to re-energize these places. It's not going to help us implement the visions for the future that we saw from the talent urban design competition. There are a lot of rules that are in place, and people are really respectful of these rules. But there is also the need to really work around those rules and maybe move towards something which is different from the traditional planning. And maybe it's called action planning. Maybe it's called social action planning, because it's also about mobilizing homeowners, investors, community leaders, all of you here, young people. We saw some really creative and interesting ideas today. A lot of the call today in bringing back places from the housing crisis is really related to the global investor. I know that Philanthropy is also doing its part, attracting global investors, providing residence status to people if they really invest in housing, and that has actually contributed to the positive bounce back in the housing markets. You know, actually, this is done in the United States. This is done, not surprisingly, in Spain. And it's also done in Greece and many other countries, such as Portugal, for example. The catch is the global investor is not here to stay. The global investor is not going to choose a lot of these suburban neighborhoods. They're likely going to move to Jurmala or the Old Town or the Art Nouveau district. So it is very, very important that the call for action is really out there, that it's quite clear and explicit that a strategic policy framework for neighborhood action is needed. And it's not just about physical change, it's also about social capital and social networks and the power of people and communities to bring that change about. What it also means in the case of Riga is really an important emphasis on partnerships with private organizations. There is a very robust private sector here. There has always been a tradition of social responsibility. This is what created a lot of the cultural institutions in Riga in the past and continues to make a fine contribution to a cultural legacy of a very vibrant city. So really it's important to tap into the pulse of that social responsibility of private corporations, the housing industry, the banks, but also the non-profit sector and neighborhood-based institutions. Someone today in the morning actually talked about a community developer, and I'm not sure whether that term exists. In the United States, they're called community-based organizations. That is going to be a different developer that is going to take on the task of city building in those challenging areas and really work with different stakeholders. And certainly the city leadership is commendable. The fact that they're very candid about what they can do and what is it that actually limits their opportunities to intervene effectively. It's also important to bring the central government back. They're really a very important player in housing policy in any country. It's really unfortunate that there is disconnect. The decentralization is fine. It gives a lot of autonomy to local governments, but a lot of fiscal unfunded mandates. And that is a very, very critical constraint in the housing area and the neighborhood rebuilding that really needs to take place. And the final comment that I'd like to make is about small-scale projects. It's really important to start small and think big. And what we've seen today, there were some really fine examples of placemaking, of really community-driven change, of design ideas that were really creative and innovative. It's very important to have a buy-in, to have a more strategic way of moving forward. I think, unfortunately, last year in the city of Riga had muddled through 2 decades of housing policy making and unmaking. A lot of trial and error, and maybe what I've sensed today, and some people this morning were very optimistic about the spirit of change and the fact that there is evidence-based research and policy-informed research which perhaps is going to make a difference in the future. I'd like to come back to the idea of a manifesto which was introduced very early in the morning by the chief architect. This is a very, very important outcome of this conference, and it's going to move everyone forward in a forceful and important way. Think about it, and it was very nice that it's open-ended and everyone in the spirit of democratic decision-making, which is actually quite impressive here in Riga, is allowed to comment and contribute. So I'm really curious to see the outcome of that process and the new manifesto that is going to follow. But it's a first and very important step towards more strategic, more flexible, action-driven planning. A final note, it really takes a village to raise a child. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but it really takes a city to bring the neighborhood back, one place at a time. And I feel that this process has a very, very good beginning. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a privilege to be part of that conference and the new and emerging discourse for transformation of the East.
Inspiring. It was important, and it was most of all fascinating that to hear the best marketing ever for my own profession, social planning. So it was wonderful. I was wondering, somebody like you who had a very, I would say, who had really an impact 10 years ago or 12, 13 years ago in working together with state officials and city officials, and who has done quite some detailed research in that time. Coming back here, 10 years when done that, and then sitting on the podium and like saying, okay, we have the first lost decade, and we have probably a second lost decade. Then the question is, what? You gave us some ideas, but what to do not to lose the next decade, the third decade of Latvian independence, or second Latvian independence. How, for example, and that is what was coming for me again and again and again through as a message from you, maybe more a hidden message, or a question that has to be raised and asked. How do we manage then to invite everybody, not only officials, not only experts and planners, also inhabitants? How do we invite people in order to take this initiative to steer planning, to really say like, okay, we are the public and we kind of need to steer something. We cannot just leave it on the market risk. We cannot leave it just free-floating. We can be, and we have to be, as you said, and being flexible, very important, but how can we steer, how we can engage people to take this? And for sure, probably officials have to make the sign as first ones. So, how can we engage?
Well, it's an excellent question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer, but the commitment to change. It's not, these are very complex environments. It really, if we can build a city overnight, the Romans would have done that. It's really important to have a strategic view. It's also important to be able to provide strong leadership, but it's also important to provide the right mix of incentives. I think people at the end of the day are very reasonable. They vote with their feet. That's why there is a lot of hope with the energy efficiency retrofits. But what this program does, because it sends the right incentive, but what this program does, it really deals with buildings, and it doesn't deal with life between buildings, and it doesn't deal with the lost spaces between buildings. This is something that, again, in a very opportunistic way, the city could champion because it has some responsibility for the infrastructure. But again, to a limited extent, because there are private interests and landowners involved, and it really, it's a very challenging issue when you own the land on which there is a playground. And as a landowner with private property rights engraved in the constitution of any country, you get to see a few kids actually going to that playground every now and then. So there is more here in Riga that needs to happen. And that's why the engagement of residents and owners is very, very important. Getting the central government on board is very important. Tapping into the opportunities that the structural funds present is very, very important. And being part of various groups, and Tsenkova has actually managed to arrange for structural funds to be earmarked for social housing and neighborhood improvements. And a lot of countries are trying to do just that. So being opportunistic, being well-informed, being the kind of socially minded design professional that is oriented towards action, it is going to be very much needed.
So you state if we kind of miss the track, we probably will lose the game even more than we do it already now, with a loss of, I would say, we are even near to less than 760,000. We are shrinking continuously, and it's not only the suburban migration or the sprawl, in fact, it is very much more also the migration out of the country. So exactly there, I guess, the socially invested person, the socially investing person is needed in this moment. So do we lose a track then? Are we lost in I don't know.
I'm not sure. Sometimes we like to use those metaphors. I actually think that there is surprising resilience when it comes to Riga as a city and the ability of its spatial structure to accommodate change. And that is very positive. And also the ability of people and different organizations. Yesterday I had the chance to meet some of the private institutions and private investors. And it's really amazing how they managed to cope with the very, very dramatic conditions and situation of change. So it's important to understand the motivation of different players in this process. A lot of it is about social responsibility and retaining the social mix that the city has, which, interestingly enough, a lot of other cities, including Vienna and Amsterdam and Paris, are trying to pursue deliberately through fiscal planning and very aggressive regulatory regime. Here, that is an asset, and it's important to maintain it. It's also important to understand that a huge loss of residential capital has occurred. Not in terms of just number of dwellings or square meters, but in terms of housing quality. And this is something that actually Riga had. So it is really critical to be able to set up the mechanisms and the environment within which the retrofitting and rebuilding of that capital can take place.
Thank you. That was a message. That was a strong message. You were very much stressing the interdisciplinarity, the multidisciplinarity all the time. I think that's very much what we all, many who are sitting here in this room, and we try to like work upon in the moment. I mean, I would really like to say one of the qualities, as you mentioned it, one of the qualities specifically in the last 2 to 3 years in Riga is that we have an emergent democratic attitude, that people really start to engage themselves, that they have a voice. Yet, we are not yet communicating all on one table. And that is exactly this phenomena that we are all like observing, where we are all discussing about constantly. How do we bring us all on one table in order to, we talk about the integrated planning approach, to integrate planning. So that was probably more a question also to the audience. How can we reply to that what Sasha is asking for? Probably many studies and researchers are asking who are seriously working on this problems, let's call it like that. Any questions, comments, ideas, feedbacks, whatsoever? Interesting.
Time for action. What else I have to say?
You should say it in the microphone.
Time for action. I think things are happening. That is obvious in Riga, and I hope that politicians, little by little, will start to realize that they really have organized themselves and organized all those that have, let's say, positive vision on development. People will understand which direction they have to go. I would like to thank you very much for this fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Sasha, for the presentation. You are a professor, right? So you are teaching this work.
Yes.
Could you elaborate briefly on the challenges of education in design and planning according to the issues you described? How should education institutions respond to the complex issues?
I think part of the reason I'm probably a notorious mover, lived in many places, worked in many places, pay taxes in many places. One of the reasons why I moved to the University of Calgary is because this is a graduate faculty that is interdisciplinary. So it's not about architecture and planning, it's also about interdisciplinary design. And I think that this is the future of our education indeed, if we want to be part of positive change in our society. It's not just about thinking about sustainability, but being able to walk the talk and being able to make the case for change. And quite frankly, very often architects and landscape architects and planners work in isolation. They still continue to do so. It takes a while to learn the language of the economist and the developer to be a real partner at the negotiating table. And so that is the challenge of interdisciplinary education. It takes longer, but it is a much more rounded career. And then the ability really to influence the outcome of your projects is much more positive. So I do believe in interdisciplinary education. I do believe that also the work that is done in Riga Technical University and also Latvia University is really fine, and I think that particularly the move towards effective implementation of sustainability requires interdisciplinary education and approaches so that we educate a different cohort of professionals, and a lot of you here are the leaders of the future. So being able to develop the business case and market it to the politicians of Riga, for that matter, is really a tall order. And it's not going to be something that architects can do in their own right, or planners for that matter. You would need to work with the developers, and it was actually very nice to see the comments and hear the comments from someone who was an economist and a developer earlier in the discussion in the morning. So that is part of the philosophy of interdisciplinary education. We also engage students in real-life research and projects. So it's not just about studies, it's also about studies where we work with real clients, and that has been a very important element of my career as a consultant to international institutions, but also as an educator. We also do design and build. A group of our students built a pop-up park, a few benches, and some street furniture in a place in Calgary's downtown, where people still come. We actually did that on purpose to engage young people in something that is quite real. We observed, obviously, the neighborhood. There was demand for these types of intervention. They're still there, and they're actually quite popular. I'm not sure if the people of Calgary are more disciplined, or we just really engaged a lot of the local residents in that process, so they actually go and use the benches, they play chess there, and children play in the sandbox. So that is perhaps a very integral element of my philosophy as an educator.
Excellent. You were also mentioning urban agriculture.
Yes.
Think small, or work small, think big. Actually, I think we, as you already realized that today in the sessions, you have seen various small projects that are actually going on in Riga, and I think we have really something to offer. I mean, well, it might not be steered as complex as it is happening in Tallinn, but there is a lot of, sometimes a bit anarchic, but interesting process going on. But what I wonder is, because we have some representatives also of those projects here, I was thinking about Manalika, for example, who's also observing this process. That are those small initiatives feeling that they are wished, that they are wanted, that they are actually invited to engage themselves, to really bring something for the better good of society, planning, architecture. Might somebody from Manalika, for example, reply to that? It would be very interesting.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was actually really meaningful, and I think the critical content was really crucial for you pointed out. As a part of the Riga project and to deliver an answer for your question, Jonas, I think we won't be doing this if we're not feeling that we are invited. The main reason we are dealing with all these small projects, small initiatives with article making about city and actually in ENG we are just implementing these courtyard projects with wooden pallet furniture, is the fact that all these micro-scale initiatives are just needed. The city needs that kind of approach, and the city needs some kind of case studies actually, because it is a way how to deliver a message understandable for our community. And within this process, the community can see and get involved afterwards in that placemaking process, as from the space to place, and actually the local expertise is the most needed. And I think it's growing. As you know, we are not the first initiative that is dealing with this kind of questions. We have many colleagues, and I think actually older people. We are, for example, Tom's Cookings, and we know the funding group is the Riga project, which was an amazing thing, and actually it's getting joining cafeterias, etc., etc. I don't know if I answered your question, but if we are sort of needed, I think we are, because the feedback we are getting from the community, and maybe it's because of the reason that we are really pushing to speak with the people in their language, actually to avoid all this professional language that actually people are scared of at some point because they're used to what kind of top-down planning actually really is. So yeah, we are feeling challenged by many problems, but also invited from the local community to do that because people are starting to feel that they are really capable of doing some things, even at the micro scale, but small things matter.
Well, if I may comment on that, small is really beautiful, and I think that your work is actually quite inspiring. I'm sure a lot more people will follow. And it's not just a popular trend. It's just a natural aspect of urban activism of people just being engaged. But in a lot of these suburban neighborhoods, it's also very much needed because they deserve to have an identity. They actually deserve to have a name. And they deserve to have their own landmarks and place-making strategies. And that is a very creative expression of whatever people felt was important for that place. And if in doubt, you can always plant a tree. And I'm sure that it will stay because people in the city is so very green, but they do have special appreciation for the green and the blue assets of Riga. Having said that, I also feel that there's a lot of talent, and I've seen a lot of really very fine design, which was a very pleasant surprise in Riga, but also in Neighbourhoods, which I visited yesterday. There's a pedestrian bridge and a very significant improvement to the public realm that the city commissioned. By the way, very entrepreneurial local government in that city. But certainly there is a lot of creative talent and some interesting landmarks. We could debate about the quality of architecture. Time is really going to tell whether some of these landmark buildings are going to be successful or not. But it's really an important element of identity and discovering places and their natural beauty or their unique competitive advantage. And I'm sure that a lot of these suburban neighborhoods are going to follow that trajectory. In fact, some have by their own initiative or following the market logic because they're too close to the city center. They were perhaps more proactive, so new developments materialized as opposed to having a vast nondescript green space that quite frankly no one seems to own or cherish. So overall it's a challenge, but it is a great opportunity to leave your imprint on the future of Riga's city. And again, it's a very resilient city. It's a beautiful one, and one that has survived the test of time for over 800 years.
Igor, a journalist, I have a general question, but with some practical aspects. Why some places are in more or less sustainable development, but others are not? So what is contemporary qualities that make one place urban and distinguishes it from, let's say, countryside? And these urban areas, are they urban now with some specific qualities? Or it is just historical, heritage, legacy? And now we're living in Marshall McLuhan's slow village with some crazy money, just running, and we don't know, in irrational way, stopping somewhere and then running further. So modern city, modern urban development. Why?
Well, this is a difficult question. I must admit that I'm a person who loves cities, and I have spent a lifetime trying to understand cities and make them better. So probably have a fair amount of urban bias. But I've also worked in cities in Europe and North America and Asia. And it's really surprisingly interesting to find out that what cities have to offer is exactly that messy vitality, a number of opportunities. Cities are really islands in a rural hinterland, and yet they've always attracted people to city life because they offer something unique. And maybe that's an opportunity for a career, a unique job, a cultural evolution, an expression an interpretation of places that perhaps is quite unique, and you might not be able to experience it in the rural area. Cities also bring a lot of anonymity, and the fact that we live close together doesn't mean that we know each other. And very often the assumption, a lot of the presentations today we're talking about, social connections and people really being able to use spaces together. There is some of that togetherness and the social bridging, but there is also a great deal of anonymity and competitiveness in the city. But by and large, the reason for success is really the ability to offer a lot of diverse opportunities with respect to economic, social, as well as personal opportunities for people, and that has always been a critical attribute of successful cities. Something that the New World hasn't been able to emulate and replicate. I think in North America it's a well-known fact. We live in suburbs, and yet more and more as cities reach a critical threshold, actually people come back to the city center, where there is that diversity, there is the messy vitality, there is obviously the inconvenience of really living together with many different strangers, people from different walks of life. And yet there is something very inspiring and positive about that diversity that, in fact, we need to bring to the suburbs, and it being concerted efforts to do so. In some cases, really the romantic feeling of a small town, of a rural area where everyone knows everyone else, where people walk to work and walk to the main square, and that is nostalgically recreated in the suburbs. It doesn't have that diversity. It doesn't have that vibrancy as well. So something is lacking. So over and over time, and in different countries and different places, people have been attracted to cities, and some lose and some gain as a result of this process. There are great stories of cities that have been able to reinvent themselves. And there are also great stories of cities that were capitals of huge empires that never really came back. But in retrospect, cities are seen today as something that is very, very vital and essential for sustainability, as you mentioned. And it's probably because of that massive concentration of people and assets, and private as well as public investments that actually make the cities work. There's always been a recipe for efficiency. And if you look at old Riga, it was very efficient in its own right. So people would use the space in the city center for productive purposes. They would live there, they would share stories there, and it was quite clear that there were some benefits. There were real economic and social drivers that were part of that city formation that didn't exist in the rural areas.
So, when we summarize, we can say Riga means its neighborhoods, specifically also with that term. Riga is nothing without its neighborhoods, but the thing is also nothing without its old city. So we need a vibration of old city and neighborhoods, a kind of concert. But most of all, I'd like to summarize that I would like to thank you once again, but most of all for that kind of impressive passion that you have towards the city, towards the urbanity and this dimension, and to bring it as an architect and as a planner also to this extreme extent of social dimension. That is really a big pleasure to have seen that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.